Commander Zethkar had seen war across 17 star systems. His forearms bore the scars of battles against the savage Krillian horde, the calculating Void Seekers, and the relentless machine consciousness of Sector 9. Each species brought their own brand of terror to the battlefield. The Krillians with their berserker rage, the Void Seekers with their cold precision, the machines with their endless endurance. But humans? Humans were supposedly the weakest of all the Coalition species. Standing in the command center of the orbital defense platform above Kepler 442b, Zethkar watched the tactical displays with growing unease. The Shadow Maw Collective had broken through the outer defensive perimeter with frightening efficiency. Their bioships moved like predators through space, dark organic hulls pulsing with alien life, launching swarms of smaller attack craft that could tear through standard armor plating like it was paper. "Sir, the third defensive line has fallen," reported Lieutenant Cora, her crystalline form shimmering with anxiety. "The Shadow Maws are advancing on the civilian evacuation zones." Zethkar's mandibles clicked in frustration. 3 Coalition fleets had already been decimated trying to hold the line. The Valorian shock troops, renowned across the galaxy for their ferocity, had lasted exactly 14 minutes before being overrun. The Ethereal Guard, masters of energy manipulation, had managed 37 minutes before their formations shattered. "What about the human contingent?" Zethkar asked, though he already knew it was a desperate question. The humans had only joined the Coalition 18 months ago, and their military contributions had been unremarkable. They were decent engineers, adequate tacticians, but physically they were among the weakest sapient species in known space. No natural armor, limited sensory capabilities, no psionic abilities, and a lifespan that barely reached a century. "The human fleet is requesting permission to engage," Cora replied, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "How many ships?" 47 vessels, sir. Mixed class." Zethkar felt his secondary heart sink. 47 ships against a Shadow Maw invasion force that had already torn through 3 full battle fleets. It would be a massacre, but perhaps their sacrifice would buy enough time for the civilian evacuation to complete. "Grant them permission," he said quietly, "and prepare to document their final actions. They deserve that much." The human fleet moved into position with surprising coordination. Zethkar had expected them to adopt standard Coalition battle formations, but instead they spread out in loose clusters, each group moving independently. Their ships were oddly designed, too. Blocky, angular vessels that looked more like flying industrial complexes than warships. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the human flagship," Cora announced. The main display flickered to life, revealing a human female with short dark hair and calm eyes. She wore a simple uniform without the elaborate ceremonial elements favored by most Coalition officers. "This is Admiral Chen of the Terran Defense Force," she said, her voice steady. "We are beginning our attack run. I want to make something clear to all Coalition forces observing this engagement. What you are about to see may seem impossible. Do not attempt to replicate our tactics without proper training and equipment. Human combat doctrine is unique." The transmission ended, leaving Zethkar puzzled. What could these fragile beings possibly do that hardened warriors like the Valorians could not? The answer came within minutes. The first wave of Shadow Maw bioships had barely registered the approaching human vessels when space erupted in violence unlike anything Zethkar had ever witnessed. The humans didn't engage in the standard long-range energy exchanges that characterized most space combat. Instead, their ships accelerated directly toward the enemy formation, their hulls bristling with weapons that seemed to appear from hidden compartments. But it wasn't just the quantity of weapons that shocked him. It was how they used them. The humans fought dirty. They targeted non-critical systems first, crippling mobility and sensors before moving in for killing blows. They used their own damaged ships as kinetic weapons, ramming enemy vessels with calculated precision. When enemy bioships attempted to swarm a human cruiser, the humans vented their own atmosphere to create explosive decompression, using the blast to clear the attackers. "What are they doing?" Cora whispered, her crystalline form flickering with confusion as she watched human marines breach the hull of a Shadow Maw vessel using what appeared to be controlled nuclear detonations. Zethkar couldn't answer. He watched in stunned silence as human fighters ignored standard safety protocols, pushing their engines far beyond recommended parameters to execute maneuvers that should have been impossible. Their pilots seemed to have no regard for their own survival, throwing their craft into attack runs that bordered on suicidal. One human destroyer, its hull cracked and bleeding atmosphere, deliberately flew into the mouth of a massive Shadow Maw bioship. Zethkar expected to see the vessel dissolved by the creature's digestive acids. Instead, the ship exploded from within, tearing the bioship apart in a shower of organic debris. They're winning, Cora breathed. It was true. Against all logic and military doctrine, the human fleet was systematically dismantling the Shadow Maw formation. But the cost was horrific. Zethkar watched human ships die in ways that would have broken the morale of any other species, yet the remaining vessels continued their assault with undiminished ferocity. A transmission crackled through the command center. This time it was from a human ground force commander, a grizzled male whose face was streaked with something Zethkar didn't recognize at first. Then he realized it was blood, the human's own blood. "This is Colonel Martinez," the man said, his voice rough but determined. "Shadow Maw ground forces have broken through our perimeter. We're falling back to secondary positions, but we need immediate orbital support on Grid 77 Alpha." In the background, Zethkar could hear sounds that chilled him. The wet, tearing noise of Shadow Maw feeding appendages, the screams of wounded humans, and underneath it all, something that took him a moment to identify. Human laughter. They were laughing as they fought and died. Admiral Chen's voice cut through the chaos. "Negative on orbital support, Colonel. You're too close to civilian evacuation routes." "Understood, Admiral," Martinez replied without hesitation. "We'll handle it." The transmission ended, and Zethkar found himself leaning forward, desperate to see what the humans would do. The tactical display showed Shadow Maw ground forces advancing on human positions with overwhelming numbers. Standard protocol would be to withdraw and regroup, but these were humans. The answer came in the form of a seismic tremor that shook the entire planet. The humans had triggered some kind of geological instability, creating an artificial earthquake that swallowed half the Shadow Maw ground force. But it also buried their own forward positions. "They sacrificed their own troops," Cora said, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Zethkar corrected, finally beginning to understand. "They sacrificed themselves. There's a difference." As the battle raged on, Zethkar began to see patterns in the human fighting style that defied everything he thought he knew about warfare. They fought like a species that had nothing left to lose, yet their tactics were too sophisticated, too coordinated for desperation. This wasn't the random violence of a dying race. This was something else entirely. The humans seemed to view their own bodies, their own ships, their own lives as weapons to be expended for tactical advantage. They fought with a combination of technological innovation and sheer bloody-mindedness that left even the Shadow Maws confused and disoriented. When the main Shadow Maw command vessel appeared, a monstrous bioship the size of a small moon, Zethkar was certain the human fleet would finally break. The creature's psychic emanations alone had been known to drive entire species insane. Its defensive capabilities could withstand the combined firepower of a dozen dreadnoughts. Instead, the humans did something unprecedented. They stopped fighting. For nearly 30 seconds, the entire human fleet went silent. No weapons fire, no communications, No movement. The Shadow Maws, equally puzzled, paused their advance. Then Admiral Chen's voice echoed across all frequencies. All human forces, this is Admiral Chen. Initiate Protocol 7. Authorization Omega Black. Zethkar had never heard of Protocol 7, but the response was immediate and terrifying. Every human ship simultaneously began broadcasting what sounded like music, but not just any music. It was something primal and haunting, a song that seemed to speak directly to something deep within every human soul. As the music played, the human fleet began moving in perfect synchronization, their previous loose formations tightening into something resembling a massive organism. They moved as one entity, 47 ships acting with single-minded purpose. What happened next would haunt Zethkar's dreams for the rest of his considerably long life. The human fleet didn't attack the Shadow Maw command vessel. They embraced it. Every ship, every fighter, every last human war machine threw itself at the bioship with such coordinated fury that the creature's defensive systems couldn't track them all. They covered its surface like antibodies attacking an infection, each vessel finding weak points and exploiting them with surgical precision. The massive bioship thrashed and writhed, but the humans held on. They burrowed into its hull using mining charges, sealed the breaches behind them, and continued their assault from within. The creature's death throes were visible from orbit as its bioluminescent organs flickered and failed one by one. When it finally died, taking most of the human fleet with it, the remaining Shadow Maw forces simply fled. They had never encountered anything like human warfare, and their species' survival instincts overrode their invasion programming. Silence fell across the battlefield. Of the 47 human ships that had engaged the enemy, only 3 remained intact. The casualty reports would make for grim reading. 87% human casualties, with many of the survivors bearing injuries that would have killed most other species. Yet as Zethkar watched the surviving human ships limp back to formation, he heard something over the communications that sent chills through his exoskeleton. The humans were singing again, not the primal war song they had used in battle, but something softer, sadder, a dirge for their fallen comrades. Admiral Chen appeared on the main display one final time. Her uniform was torn and stained, her face bearing fresh scars, but her eyes remained steady. "Admiral Chen reporting mission complete," she said simply. "Shadow Maw forces have been neutralized, requesting permission to assist with civilian evacuation efforts." Zethkar found his voice with difficulty. "Permission granted, Admiral, and thank you." Chen nodded once. "Just doing our job, sir." As the transmission ended, Zethkar turned to Cora, who was still staring at the tactical displays in shock. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "I want you to prepare a detailed report on human combat capabilities. Mark it Priority Alpha and forward it to High Command immediately." "What should I tell them, sir?" Zethkar looked back at the tactical display, where human ships were already beginning rescue operations despite their own critical damage. "Tell them that we need to revise our understanding of what makes a warrior," he said. "Tell them that strength isn't just about physical capability or technological superiority. Tell them that the humans fight like no other species in the galaxy because they fight for something we don't fully understand yet." He paused, watching a damaged human frigate use its own hull plating to patch a hole in a civilian transport. "And tell them that I hope we never have to face humans as enemies, because after what I've seen today, I'm not sure any force in the galaxy could stop them if they ever decided we were the threat." Outside the command center's viewports, the human fleet continued its rescue operations, their battle-scarred ships moving with the same determined precision they had shown in combat. They had lost nearly everything, yet they continued to serve, continued to protect, continued to fight. For the first time in his military career, Commander Zethkar felt something he had never experienced before when watching an alien species in combat. He felt humbled. 3 months had passed since the Battle of Kepler 442b, and Commander Zethkar found himself stationed at Coalition Intelligence Headquarters on Proxima Station. His report on human combat capabilities had caused quite a stir among the higher command structure. Some called it exaggerated. Others demanded immediate investigation. A few suggested that humans might pose a long-term threat to coalition stability. Zethkar had been assigned to lead the Human Combat Analysis Division, a newly created department tasked with understanding exactly what made human warriors so devastatingly effective. It wasn't the assignment he had expected, but after witnessing the destruction of the Shadow Maw invasion force, he knew it was necessary work. His office overlooked the station's main docking bay, where human vessels came and went with increasing frequency. The Coalition had quietly begun assigning human units to more dangerous missions, and their success rate was becoming impossible to ignore. Yet the more Zethkar studied their methods, the more confused he became. "Sir, we've received the after-action reports from the Andromeda Frontier incident," announced Dr. Yalara, his ethereal research partner. Her translucent form shimmered with concern as she transmitted the data directly to his neural interface. Zethkar reviewed the information quickly. A human strike force of just 12 vessels had somehow eliminated a fortified pirate stronghold that had resisted coalition forces for over 2 years. The pirates, a mixed group of rogue Valorians and exiled machine consciousness units, should have been more than capable of handling such a small force. "How many human casualties?" he asked. 17 wounded, 0 fatalities, Yalara replied, her confusion evident in the fluctuation of her energy field. Zethkar's mandibles clicked in disbelief. "That's impossible. The pirate stronghold was built inside a fortified asteroid with multiple defensive platforms. Standard assault doctrine would predict at least 60% casualties for an attacking force that small." "Perhaps you should review the tactical footage," Yalara suggested. The holographic display activated, showing the human assault from multiple angles. Zethkar watched as the human ships approached the asteroid using what appeared to be suicide tactics, flying directly into the teeth of the defensive grid. But instead of being destroyed, the human vessels seemed to dance between the weapon systems, their pilots executing maneuvers that pushed the boundaries of physics. "Computer, analyze the flight patterns and calculate the G-forces experienced by the human crews," Zethkar commanded. The results made him step back in shock. The human pilots were pulling maneuvers that should have liquefied their internal organs, yet they continued fighting as if the crushing acceleration meant nothing. But that wasn't the most disturbing part of the engagement. When the human forces reached the asteroid's surface, they didn't attempt to breach the fortified entrances. Instead, they used mining charges to create new openings in unexpected locations, coordinating their assault with such precision that they bypassed most of the defensive systems entirely. The pirates, confused by the unconventional approach, found themselves fighting a multi-front battle inside their own stronghold. The humans moved through the asteroid's tunnels like they had been born in zero gravity, using the confined spaces to their advantage rather than being hindered by them. "Look at this section," Yalara said, highlighting a particular segment of the footage. Zethkar watched as a squad of human marines encountered a group of Valorian defenders in a narrow corridor. The Valorians, each twice the size of the humans and equipped with powered armor, should have easily overpowered the smaller force. Instead, the humans used the corridor's dimensions against their enemies, employing tactics that turned the Valorians' superior size into a liability. One human marine deliberately allowed himself to be grabbed by a Valorian warrior, then detonated a shaped charge that killed both of them but collapsed the ceiling on the remaining enemy forces. The other humans immediately pressed their advantage, pouring through the breach while their enemies were still recovering from the explosion. "They used one of their own soldiers as a weapon," Zethkar murmured. "The tactical logs show it was a voluntary action," Yalara added. "The Marine requested permission to execute the maneuver." Zethkar had seen enough suicide tactics during the Shadow Maw battle to expect this, but it still disturbed him. Not because it was ineffective, quite the opposite. The humans seemed to have weaponized self-sacrifice in ways that no other species had ever conceived. A chime indicated an incoming transmission. The main display activated to reveal Admiral Chen, now bearing additional insignia indicating her promotion to Coalition Strategic Command. "Commander Zethkar," she said with a slight nod. "I understand you've been studying our combat methods." "That's correct, Admiral. Your species' effectiveness in battle has raised questions among the Coalition leadership." Chen's expression remained neutral. "What kind of questions?" Zethkar hesitated. The truth was that some Coalition officials were beginning to view humans as a potential threat. A species that fought with such devastating efficiency and apparent disregard for conventional rules of engagement made many of his superiors nervous. Questions about training methods, tactical doctrines, and... He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The psychological factors that enable your warriors to function in situations that would break most other species." "I see." Chen leaned back in her chair. "Commander, would you be interested in observing a human military training exercise? It might help answer some of your questions." The offer was unexpected, but Zethkar recognized an opportunity when he saw one. "I would be very interested, Admiral." "Excellent. Report to Training Facility Omega on Earth's third moon in 72 hours. And Commander, bring medical supplies. You're going to need them." The transmission ended, leaving Zethkar staring at the blank screen. Admiral Chen's final comment had sounded less like advice and more like a warning. 72 hours later, Zethkar found himself standing on the surface of Luna, watching human recruits prepare for what their instructors called Basic Combat Readiness Assessment. The facility was unlike any military training ground he had ever seen. Instead of neat, organized ranges and obstacle courses, the landscape had been transformed into a hellish maze of urban ruins, toxic swamps, and simulated alien environments. "Welcome to Hell Week," said Colonel Martinez, the same grizzled human officer Zethkar had heard during the Shadow Maw battle. His scars had healed, but new ones had taken their place. 200 recruits started this exercise 5 days ago. 63 remain. "What happened to the others?" Yalara asked, her form flickering with concern. "Medical discharge, psychological breaks, or voluntary withdrawal," Martinez replied matter-of-factly. "We don't accept everyone. Military service isn't for the weak." Zethkar watched as a group of human recruits emerged from what appeared to be a simulated Shadow Maw hive. Their uniforms were torn and stained with substances he preferred not to identify. Several showed obvious signs of injury, yet they moved with the same determined precision he had observed in veteran human forces. "This is just basic training?" he asked incredulously. "This is the final phase of basic training," Martinez corrected. "The recruits you're watching have been here for 6 months. They've been pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance, and most have exceeded those limits multiple times." As if to illustrate his point, one of the recruits collapsed from exhaustion. Zethkar expected the exercise to halt while medical attention was provided, but instead the recruit's teammates simply picked him up and continued their mission. The fallen soldier protested weakly, insisting he could continue on his own, but his comrades ignored him. "They take care of each other," Martinez observed, noting Zethkar's confusion. "That's the most important lesson we teach here. Individual strength means nothing if you can't function as part of a unit." The training exercise continued for hours. Zethkar watched humans navigate scenarios that would have challenged experienced Coalition special forces. They fought simulated battles against multiple enemy types, survived in hostile environments with minimal equipment, and endured psychological stress tests that seemed designed to break their spirits. Yet throughout it all, they maintained unit cohesion. When one soldier fell, others compensated. When supplies ran low, they shared what little they had. When faced with impossible choices, they found ways to succeed that didn't involve abandoning their comrades. "I don't understand," Zethkar finally admitted. "How do you train them to fight with such disregard for personal safety?" Martinez turned to face him, and Zethkar was struck by the intensity in the human's eyes. "We don't train them to disregard their safety, Commander. We train them to value something more than their safety. Such as each other, their mission, the people they're sworn to protect." Martinez gestured toward the recruits, who were now helping each other through a particularly challenging obstacle. "A human who fights only for himself is just another soldier. A human who fights for others becomes something more." The explanation didn't satisfy Zethkar. He had seen countless species with strong social bonds, yet none of them fought with the same desperate effectiveness as humans. There had to be something else, some factor he wasn't seeing. His answer came during the final phase of the exercise. The remaining recruits were tasked with rescuing simulated civilians from a collapsing structure while under enemy fire. It was an impossible scenario designed to test decision-making under extreme stress. Most species would have prioritized the mission based on logical parameters: save the greatest number, minimize casualties, retreat if the situation became untenable. The human recruits ignored logic entirely. They split into small teams, each taking responsibility for specific groups of civilians, and began the rescue operation with no apparent regard for the tactical situation. Zethkar watched in fascination as the humans used their own bodies to shield civilians from falling debris. They formed human chains to pass wounded civilians to safety, even as simulated enemy fire concentrated on their positions. When the structure began its final collapse, several recruits remained inside to ensure the last civilians were evacuated. The exercise ended with all simulated civilians rescued and only minor injuries among the human forces. By any logical analysis, they should have failed catastrophically. Their tactical decisions had been questionable at best, their disregard for personal safety bordering on suicidal. Yet they had succeeded. "Now do you understand?" Martinez asked, watching as the exhausted recruits helped each other to their feet. "I'm beginning to," Zethkar replied, "but I still have questions." "Ask them. Why do they do it? What drives them to fight with such intensity?" Martinez was quiet for a long moment, watching his soldiers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Zethkar's secondary heart skip a beat. "Because we know what it's like to be alone," Martinez said simply. "Humans evolved on a world that was trying to kill us every day. We survived because we learned to depend on each other, to sacrifice for the group, to fight against impossible odds because the alternative was extinction." He turned to face Zethkar directly. "Every other species in the coalition comes from worlds where they were the dominant predator, the apex species. You never had to learn what it means to be prey. We did, and that knowledge changes how you see the universe." Zethkar felt a chill run through his exoskeleton. "You fight like a prey species?" "We fight like a species that remembers what it was like to be hunted," Martinez corrected. "We fight like every battle might be our last, because for most of human history that was true. And we fight together because we know that alone we're weak. But together we can face anything." As they walked back toward the transport, Zethkar found himself viewing the human recruits in an entirely new light. They weren't warriors in the traditional sense. They were survivors. Every tactical doctrine, every training method, every sacrifice they made was driven by the deep-seated knowledge that survival required unity, determination, and the willingness to pay any price for victory. It was a sobering realization. The coalition had welcomed humans as junior partners, assuming they would fill support roles while the stronger species handled the real fighting. But Zethkar was beginning to understand that they had been thinking about it backwards. Humans weren't weak allies who needed protection. They were sleeping giants who had simply never been properly awakened. And based on what he had seen, Zethkar wasn't sure the galaxy was ready for them to wake up. 6 months after visiting the human training facility, Commander Zethkar received the call he had been dreading. The Void Seekers had returned. The mechanical species had vanished from known space nearly a century ago after their war with the Coalition ended in stalemate. Most analysts believed they had retreated to rebuild their forces or had suffered some internal catastrophe. Now they were back, emerging from the galactic rim with technology that made their previous incarnation look primitive. Standing in the Coalition war room on Nexus Prime, Zethkar studied the tactical reports with growing alarm. The Void Seekers had evolved beyond their previous mechanical forms into something far more dangerous. They had learned to integrate organic components into their design, creating hybrid biomechanical entities that combined the relentless efficiency of machines with the adaptability of living tissue. 3 outer rim colonies have been completely assimilated, reported General Crixtall, his Valorian features grim. The Seekers aren't just conquering territory anymore. They're converting entire populations into components for their collective. Admiral Chen sat at the far end of the conference table, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the intelligence reports. Since the human military's recent successes, she had been given a permanent seat on the Coalition's Strategic Council, though many still questioned whether her species deserved such influence. "Estimated enemy force composition?" she asked quietly. "Initial reconnaissance suggests at least 50,000 vessels, with manufacturing capabilities that could double that number within weeks," Crixtall replied. "They've established forward bases in 7 systems and show no signs of slowing their advance." Zethkar watched the tactical displays update in real time as Coalition scout ships transmitted their final reports before being destroyed or assimilated. The Void Seekers moved with terrifying coordination, each unit perfectly synchronized with the collective whole. Their new biomechanical nature had eliminated their previous weaknesses while maintaining all of their strengths. "Recommended response?" the council chairman asked, his ancient ethereal form flickering with anxiety. General Crixtall activated a holographic battle plan. "Full mobilization of Coalition forces. We'll establish a defensive perimeter at the Centauri line and prepare for a protracted siege. If we can hold them there for 6 months, our industrial capacity should allow us to match their production capabilities." It was a sound strategy based on proven military doctrine and overwhelming numerical superiority. The Coalition could field nearly 200,000 ships if fully mobilized, and their defensive positions were well established. A traditional military mind would approve of the plan. Admiral Chen did not approve. "Request permission to speak freely," she said, her voice cutting through the strategist's confident murmuring. The chairman gestured for her to continue. "The proposed strategy will fail," Chen stated flatly. "The Void Seekers have had a century to analyze our previous tactics. They know exactly how we fight, how we think, how we make decisions. A traditional defensive strategy plays directly into their strengths." General Crixtall's battle scars darkened with anger. "And what would you propose instead, human? Your species has been part of this coalition for less than 2 years. What could you possibly know about fighting the Void Seekers that we don't?" Chen's expression never changed. "I know that they've never fought humans before." The room fell silent. Zethkar felt his secondary hearts begin to race as he realized what Chen was suggesting. After months of studying human combat doctrine, he had begun to understand how their minds worked. They didn't think like any other species in the Coalition. "Explain," the chairman commanded. Chen stood and walked to the tactical display. With a gesture, she dismissed Crixtall's defensive plan and began projecting her own analysis. The Void Seekers are a collective intelligence. Every unit shares information instantaneously, allowing them to adapt to threats and coordinate responses with perfect efficiency. Against any predictable enemy, they're unbeatable. She highlighted several points on the galactic map. But their strength is also their weakness. A collective intelligence assumes rational behavior from its opponents. It expects enemies to follow logical tactical doctrine, to preserve resources, to minimize casualties. Which is exactly what military doctrine demands, Krixtal protested. Human military doctrine is different, Chen replied. We don't fight to win battles. We fight to destroy our enemies completely, regardless of cost. Zethkar watched as Chen outlined her proposal. It wasn't a battle plan in any conventional sense. It was controlled chaos, a strategy that deliberately embraced unpredictability and accepted massive casualties in exchange for tactical advantage. You're suggesting suicide attacks, the chairman observed. I'm suggesting that we fight in a way the Void Seekers cannot predict, analyze, or counter, Chen corrected. Every human naval doctrine includes provisions for scenarios where conventional victory is impossible. We call them last resort protocols. The room erupted in protests. Council members from across the coalition voiced their objections to tactics they viewed as barbaric, unnecessary, and strategically unsound. Only Zethkar remained silent. Remembering the Battle of Kepler 442b and the devastating effectiveness of human impossible tactics. When the arguing died down, Chen continued as if nothing had happened. The Void Seekers will expect us to mass our forces at defensive choke points. Instead, we'll scatter human strike forces throughout their rear areas. Small, independent units with no central coordination and no predictable objectives. Each group will operate according to their own last resort protocols, making decisions based on immediate tactical situations rather than strategic directives. That's not a military strategy, General Krixtal said in disgust. That's organized chaos. Exactly, Chen agreed. And chaos is something a collective intelligence cannot process effectively. The debate continued for hours, but in the end, desperation won out over conventional wisdom. The coalition simply didn't have enough time to implement a traditional response. The Void Seekers were advancing too quickly, and their ability to convert conquered populations into additional forces meant that every day of delay strengthened their position. 3 days later, Zethkar found himself aboard a human dreadnought, the TDF Indomitable, as part of a joint observation mission. Admiral Chen had insisted that coalition representatives witness human tactical doctrine firsthand, both to provide accurate reports and to understand what they were unleashing. The Indomitable was unlike any warship Zethkar had ever seen. Where most coalition vessels prioritized efficiency and protection, the human ship seemed designed for one purpose only: to inflict maximum damage before being destroyed. Every surface bristled with weapons, armor plating had been sacrificed for additional firepower, and the crew quarters were so cramped that Zethkar wondered how anyone could function in such conditions. "Welcome aboard, Commander," said Captain Morrison, a weathered human female whose scars told the story of countless battles. "I hope you have a strong stomach, because this is going to get ugly." The human fleet consisted of 37 ships, ranging from massive dreadnoughts to tiny corvettes. By coalition standards, it was an insignificant force that would be swept aside by any serious enemy resistance. But Zethkar had learned not to judge human forces by conventional measures. "What is our target?" he asked as the fleet entered hyperspace. "Void Seeker Manufacturing Complex in the Epsilon Eridani system," Morrison replied. "Intelligence estimates it's producing approximately 50 new vessels per day and is defended by at least 300 enemy ships." The numbers made Zethkar's blood run cold. 37 ships against 300, with additional enemy reinforcements being manufactured continuously. Even human tactical doctrine had limits. "Captain, Surely this mission is intended as reconnaissance only? Morrison's smile was not reassuring. Commander, you're about to learn the difference between human reconnaissance and human warfare. We don't scout enemy positions. We eliminate them. When the fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Epsilon Eridani system, Zethkar immediately saw why the mission had seemed impossible. The Void Seeker manufacturing complex was massive beyond anything he had imagined, a sprawling mechanical organism that stretched across multiple asteroid fields. Hundreds of biomechanical ships patrolled its perimeter, and the space around it crawled with automated defense platforms. "All ships, this is Admiral Chen," came the transmission from the fleet flagship. "Execute Last Resort Protocol 7. Authorization is Omega Black." Zethkar recognized the authorization code from the Shadow Maw battle, but Protocol 7 was something new. As he watched, the human fleet began to separate into individual units, each ship turning toward a different target within the manufacturing complex. "What is Protocol 7? He asked Captain Morrison. "Total commitment," she replied, her hands steady on the command console. "Every ship acts independently with only one objective: cause maximum damage to enemy capabilities. No retreat, no regrouping, no mercy." The attack began without warning or coordination. 37 human ships suddenly accelerated toward the manufacturing complex from 37 different directions, each following its own tactical plan. The Void Seekers, expecting a coordinated assault that they could analyze and counter, found themselves facing an enemy that made no strategic sense. Zethkar watched in fascination as human tactics unfolded. One destroyer, heavily damaged by enemy fire, deliberately crashed into a manufacturing facility, its death triggering a cascade of explosions that destroyed half a production line. A squadron of corvettes used themselves as decoys, drawing enemy ships away from more valuable targets, while a lone dreadnought slipped through the defensive perimeter. But it was the Indomitable's assault that truly demonstrated human warfare at its most devastating. Captain Morrison guided her ship directly into the heart of the manufacturing complex, ignoring the weapons fire that stripped away armor and hull plating. "Captain, our shields are down, and we're taking critical damage," reported the tactical officer. "Understood," Morrison replied calmly. "Continue the attack run." "Captain, we should withdraw and regroup," Zethkar suggested, his survival instinct screaming as explosions rocked the ship around them. Morrison turned to face him, and in her eyes, Zethkar saw something that made him understand, finally and completely, why humans fought the way they did. It wasn't madness or desperation. It was absolute certainty that some things were worth dying for. "Commander, we didn't come here to survive," she said quietly. "We came here to win." The Indomitable punched through the manufacturing complex's central core, its weapon systems firing continuously, even as the ship began to break apart around them. Zethkar watched through the viewports as massive biomechanical constructs exploded under the human assault, their destruction sending shockwaves throughout the entire facility. As the ship's final moments approached, Morrison activated the vessel's self-destruct sequence, but not before launching every escape pod and shuttle. Even in their last extremity, the humans were still thinking about survival, not their own, but their comrades'. The explosion of the Indomitable triggered a chain reaction that destroyed 60% of the manufacturing complex and eliminated over 200 enemy vessels. The remaining human ships, many barely functional, continued their attacks until the facility was completely neutralized. When the battle ended, only 14 human ships remained operational. The casualty rate was horrific by any conventional measure, yet the humans had achieved something that should have been impossible. They had eliminated a strategic target that conventional wisdom deemed invulnerable. Sitting in an escape pod waiting for pickup, Zethkar finally understood what Admiral Chen had meant about fighting in a way the Void Seekers couldn't predict. No rational intelligence, organic or mechanical, would expect an enemy to sacrifice 90% of their force to achieve a single objective. It simply didn't compute. "Was it worth it?" he asked Captain Morrison, who was nursing burns from the ship's final moments. "Ask me that question again in 6 months," she replied. "When the Coalition fleet arrives at the Voidseeker home systems and finds their industrial capacity reduced by 40%, when their collective intelligence is still trying to process what we did here, when their perfect coordination breaks down because they can't predict our next move." She looked out at the debris field where her ship had died. "We didn't win this war today, Commander, but we changed the rules of how it will be fought, and that might be enough." Over the following weeks, as news of the human tactics spread throughout Coalition space, Zethkar began to see the broader implications of what he had witnessed. The humans hadn't just destroyed a manufacturing facility, they had introduced an element of unpredictability that was poison to a collective intelligence. Void-seeker forces began to hesitate before engaging human units, uncertain whether they were facing a conventional military force or a group of maniacs willing to turn their own ships into weapons. Their perfect coordination faltered as they tried to account for tactics that no rational species would employ. The war was far from over, but for the first time since the Void-Seekers' return, the Coalition had hope. Not because they had found a way to match their enemy's technological superiority, but because they had allies who fought with something even more powerful than logic or efficiency. They fought with humanity. And in a galaxy full of rational, predictable species, that made them the most dangerous warriors anyone had ever seen. Standing in his quarters aboard the rescue ship, Zethkar composed his final report on human combat capabilities. After months of study and observation, he finally understood what made them so effective. They weren't the strongest species in the galaxy. They weren't the smartest, or the fastest, or the most advanced. But they were the only species that treated every battle as if the survival of everything they loved depended on the outcome. And perhaps, in the end, that was exactly what the galaxy needed.